Under the pale light of dawn, the base stirred with restless energy. The ground trembled faintly as convoys rumbled to life, engines growling in staggered rhythm. Tires ground against the dust-choked gravel, and the steady thrum of generators filled the air beneath the sharper crackle of radio chatter. The sky hung low, a wash of gray streaked with hints of gold, as if the sun itself hesitated to rise fully over the tense landscape. Beyond the wire fence and layered checkpoints, the dry earth stretched toward a hazy horizon where distant ridges blurred into the morning mist. Antenna wires glinted briefly in the weak light, trembling as the breeze shifted across the encampment. The forward base, built as a temporary command post, bristled with activity. Tents lined the main thoroughfare, their canvas sides flapping against metal poles. Vehicles idled in place, the smell of exhaust mingling with dust and the faint sting of fuel. A squad of soldiers jogged past, boots thudding in practiced cadence, weapons slung across their backs, voices layered one over another, some clipped and urgent, others casual in their confidence. Officers gathered in tight clusters around folding tables covered in maps, digital screens, and printouts that rustled whenever the wind caught their edges. Orders traded hands. The tempo of preparation quickened with each passing minute. Amid the noise and bustle, Maya moved quietly, her presence barely registering among the ranks of planners and operators. She walked with a kind of deliberate grace, neither rushed nor idle. Her uniform, the same standard-issue cut as everyone else's, bore no insignia of command, no marks of rank. A simple badge pinned above her pocket read, "Liaison Translator," its edges dulled by time and handling. The fabric of her shirt had faded along the seams, sun-worn from long hours, in places just like this. At her side, a small notebook rested, its cover softened from use, corners bent, its spine creased where it had been folded back on itself again and again. In her hand, she held a pencil worn nearly to the stub. The wood stained faintly where her fingers gripped it. Maya's role here was defined in small print on the duty roster. She was meant to observe, to take notes, to relay messages between Allied forces and local contacts if needed. To the officers around her, she was part of the backdrop, no more visible than the dust that coated the edges of their boots. No one asked for her counsel. No one turned when she entered a tent or stood at the periphery of a briefing. Her voice, soft by nature, was rarely raised. Instead, she listened, tracking the flow of conversation, capturing not just the words but the tone, the subtle pauses, the shifts in phrasing that hinted at deeper currents. At one of the main tables, a colonel barked out a series of instructions, his voice cutting through the ambient noise. Maps were tapped, routes traced in the air above them as if the gestures alone could secure the ground beyond the base. Maya stood nearby, her pencil moving steadily across the page, capturing details others overlooked. Call signs, variations in phrasing between units, the way a local commander hesitated before repeating an order, as if weighing its meaning. She recorded it all, her eyes steady, her posture still. The base hummed with layered sound. A fuel truck backed toward a waiting helicopter, its beeper loud and insistent against the lower growl of engines. Radios sputtered, voices overlapping as operators tried to make themselves heard. The breeze shifted again, carrying the acrid tang of oil and the faint metallic scent of spent rounds left from a live fire drill the night before. Overhead, the radio tower cables quivered, thin lines drawn against the brightening sky. A junior officer, passing by with a clipboard in hand, glanced in Maya's direction and smirked. Without pausing, he called out to a colleague, loud enough for the words to carry across the space between them. "Google Translate in boots. That's all she is." The other officer laughed, the sound sharp and careless. Maya did not respond. She focused on the note she was making, the shape of a word in the local dialect that had changed slightly in pronunciation since the last exercise. A small detail. A vital one. But no one asked. The morning briefing gathered momentum. Inside the main tent, canvas walls strained against the breeze, casting shifting patterns of light and shadow across the assembled officers. Screens flickered under the dim glow of overhead lamps, their surfaces marred with fingerprints and the dust that settled on everything here. A major gestured broadly as he outlined the day's objectives, his voice confident, almost rehearsed. Maya, standing just inside the entrance, waited for an opening to speak. She had noted a pattern in the radio exchanges that morning, a repeated call sign paired with a phrasing shift that could cause confusion in translation. When the major paused to adjust a file on the table, Maya took a step forward and raised her hand slightly, voice measured but clear. "Sir, I believe there is a phrasing issue in the loudspeaker script. The way it reads now, it could be misunderstood by local forces as a challenge rather than a stand-down request." The major barely glanced her way, his attention already shifted to a new report handed to him by an aide. "That's just formality. We've got bigger concerns than splitting hairs on phrasing." His tone was not unkind, but final. The conversation moved on, leaving Maya standing in place, her words unheeded. Around her, the planners continued their work, voices rising in volume as confidence swelled. A radio operator called out coordinates. Another officer joked about the dust being thicker than the enemy's resolve. The group laughed, the sound blending with the mechanical noise outside. Maya withdrew slightly, returning to her position near the back wall, notebook in hand. She made a final notation, marking the phrasing concern with a small star, a habit she had formed years before. The sun climbed higher, casting harsher light through gaps in the tent. The base outside roared with life. Trucks rolled, rotors spun, and the low rumble of distant artillery echoed off unseen ridges. Maya watched, silent and steady, her eyes tracking the patterns in speech and movement that others, consumed by their roles, failed to see. The clearer those patterns became to her, the more invisible she felt. And so she stood, an island of quiet vigilance in a sea of noise, unnoticed by the very system that would soon depend on what she had seen all along. The heat inside the command tent thickened as the morning advanced. Sunlight slanted through gaps in the canvas walls, catching motes of dust that swirled in lazy patterns above the crowded tables. The air smelled of sweat and canvas, mingled with the bitter tang of cooling coffee that had been abandoned half-drunk in metal mugs. Radios hissed and crackled, voices rising and falling as operators adjusted frequencies, layered beneath the steady hum of generators straining under the weight of the day's demands. The tent felt smaller than it was, packed as it was with bodies, noise, and the weight of expectation. Maya stood near the edge of the room, notebook balanced against one palm, pencil poised but not moving for the moment. Her eyes tracked the shifting conversations, her ear tuned not only to the words spoken in English, but to the rhythm of phrases exchanged over radio in the local dialect. The script for the loudspeaker lay on the corner of a table nearby, the print crisp but already smudged at the edges from too many hands. Maya had seen the phrasing error as soon as the final draft was passed around. One word misused, a regional nuance ignored, and what was meant as a call for calm would instead sound like a veiled threat. She shifted her weight slightly, waiting for the moment to speak. The planners clustered at the main table paid her no attention. Maps overlapped one another, some hand-drawn, others printed from satellite feeds, and all of them marked with hasty notes and arrows. A major tapped at one with the end of a pen, outlining convoy timings and air support arcs, his voice confident, assured. Another officer leaned over a laptop, muttering about fuel reserves and resupply windows. The flow of conversation surged and ebbed, overlapping in waves, the urgency of logistics leaving no room for quieter voices. The tension in the air was hidden beneath the casual tone. but Maya felt it in the set of shoulders, the clipped sentences, the glances exchanged between men who knew how quickly things could go wrong. She stepped forward, lifting her voice just enough to be heard at the edge of the circle. "Sir," she began, "I believe there's an issue in the loudspeaker script. The phrasing might be misinterpreted." The major did not look up, his attention locked on the map beneath his hand. "We do not have time for semantics," he said, brushing past her words. "The message is clear enough. Move on." Maya hesitated, not from uncertainty, but because the door had closed. She lowered her voice again, returning her focus to her notebook. A junior officer nearby smirked, leaning closer to a colleague and nudging him with an elbow. "Mission Control's spell checker is worried about typos," he said in a voice pitched just low enough to seem private, just loud enough to be heard. A soft chuckle rippled between them. One of them raised a phone, snapping a picture of Maya as she stood there with her notes. A moment later, the glow of the screen confirmed the photo was already making its way through private messages. Someone added a caption, "Mission Control's spell checker. Hard at work." A captain passing behind her called out with a grin, his tone light, easy, the kind of teasing that stung more for its casualness. "Do you need to borrow Google Translate, ma'am? We can hook you up." Laughter followed, warm with camaraderie, harmless on the surface. Maya kept her face still, eyes on the script before her, pencil moving again as she underlined the word that would cause the trouble. She noted the correction in the margin of her notebook, the careful script of her handwriting at odds with the hurried scrawl that covered so much of the planner's materials. The tent grew warmer as the sun climbed higher. The fabric overhead glowed with heat, the air heavy enough to cling to skin. The smell of coffee deepened as it grew cold and bitter in forgotten cups. The radio static rose and fell, punctuated by bursts of clipped speech as operators relayed updates. The voices at the main table grew louder as the pace of the briefing accelerated, urgency creeping into the confident tone. Maya stood as she always did, steady, observing, recording what mattered most while those around her talked over one another. Her badge caught the light for a moment as the sun shifted, a small rectangle of plastic that meant nothing here, a marker of a role no one valued. Her pencil traced another note, her mind cataloging the flow of speech, the decisions made without room for doubt, the patterns in the chaos. Her notebook, worn at the edges, filled with lines of language that no one else bothered to track, became heavier in her hand. It carried the weight of truths unspoken, warnings unheard. Around her, the atmosphere tightened as the plan reached its final form. The major called for confirmation of the loudspeaker message, and a radio operator signaled readiness. The script remained unchanged. Maya's correction stayed in her notebook, unseen, unheeded. A breeze stirred the edge of the tent, lifting the flap just enough to let in a breath of cooler air before the canvas settled again. The dust outside hung in the sun's glare, a pale shimmer over the hard earth. Inside, the planners leaned closer to their screens and maps, voices falling as decisions were finalized. The energy focused now on execution rather than debate. Maya remained at the edge, silent, the sting of dismissal buried beneath the steady rhythm of her pencil as it recorded the last of what she had observed. Her calm was unbroken, her focus undisturbed. The hurt, if it showed at all, was hidden in the tightness of her grip on the notebook, the slight tension in her jaw. The final orders were given, the officers turning away from the table, ready to move. Maya stood alone at the back of the tent, her correction unspoken, her warning ignored. Around her, the machinery of command rolled forward, blind to the quiet truth that had been offered and cast aside. The radio crackled with the first of the day's commands, and outside, engines roared to life as the exercise began. Maya closed her notebook, the soft sound lost in the noise, and prepared to do what she had always done. Watch, listen, remember, and hope that this time The cost of being unheard would not be too great. By midday, the heat over the base felt as if it had settled into every crease of the earth, the air shimmering with waves that rose from the cracked ground and blurred the horizon. The ridgelines in the distance appeared to waver like ghosts. Dust clung to everything, fine as powder, and stirred by the slow grind of convoys easing out past the wire. Engines groaned under the weight of their loads. Tires bit into the dry earth, kicking up clouds that hung in the still air before drifting toward the brush that dotted the landscape. The base perimeter buzzed with activity. Troops moved in deliberate lines, their forms blurred by the haze, heads bent under helmets that glinted where sunlight struck the edges. Patrols spread outward, fanning along the boundary of the exercise zone. Above, rotors beat the air as a pair of helicopters circled, the thump of their blades lost in the wider noise. At the comms post, Maya stood, notebook open, pencil steady in hand. She watched, listened, and recorded. Her page bore the neat marks of her notes, small stars beside the points she had flagged earlier, warnings unheeded. Her uniform felt heavier now, the weight of the heat and the moment pressing down together. She kept to the shade cast by the edge of the tent, though the breeze there carried only the faintest relief. Her eyes moved between the movements on the ground and the radio rig beside her, where operators hunched over their equipment, voices tight with effort as they relayed orders and reports. The loudspeaker crackled to life, its voice booming across the field. The message came in both English and the local dialect. The words meant as a stand-down order, a reassurance to Allied and local forces alike that all was under control. But Maya's heart tightened as the translation reached her ear. The phrasing, the one she had tried to correct, came through as a challenge rather than a calming command. A single word turned on its axis, shifting meaning in the way that only language and context can do. To those hearing it from beyond the perimeter, it sounded not like peace, but like a provocation, an order to prepare for engagement. In the space of that moment, Maya felt the weight of her earlier silence forced upon her. She stepped closer to the comms rig, voice low but firm as she addressed the nearest operator. "That wording is dangerous," she said. "It sounds like a threat. We need to correct it now." The operator, face slick with sweat, fingers working the dials, barely glanced her way. His voice came tight with focus, irritation bleeding at the edges. "Not now. Ma'am, we have this under control." His attention was already back on the screen before him, the noise of overlapping channels drowning out her reply. Beyond the wire, a sudden sharp report split the air. A flare, fired too early or too close, hissed as it climbed, its light stark against the pale sky. Maya's pulse jumped as she saw the reaction ripple through the lines at the perimeter. Through the shimmer of heat, she caught the glint of binoculars raised, the shift of bodies as soldiers adjusted their stance, weapons no longer at ease but angled in readiness. Voices over the radio cracked sharper now, commands layered with urgency as officers sought to reassert control. But the phrasing error had done its work. The local force on the far side of the line had heard what it believed to be a signal of intent, and the tension that had simmered beneath the exercise flared into dangerous heat. Maya's pencil paused above the page. The note she had begun to make left unfinished as she stepped forward again. "Sir," she said to the operator at the mic, "we have to clarify now. This is escalating." The operator shook his head without looking. "Orders are clear." "Ma'am." "Stay back." His hand rested on the microphone as if to block her path, though his eyes never left the displays in front of him. Maya's gaze dropped to the loudspeaker script on the table, the line she had marked in her notes standing stark in her memory. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the page. Outside the tent, the air seemed to still, the noise of the base folding in on itself as focus narrowed to the perimeter where the mistake had echoed loudest. The loudspeaker rig, so powerful in its reach, so fragile in its dependence on accuracy, now stood as a symbol of that fragile control. The microphone that could have been the bridge now lay silent, its purpose unfulfilled. Maya felt the weight of its stillness as surely as she felt the heat pressing through the fabric of her uniform. Through the rising dust, she could see the line of local troops harden, a subtle but clear shift as posture changed, as readiness took form where moments before there had been only watchfulness. The difference in meaning, small as it was, had become large through the lens of tension, through the history that hung behind the exercise like a shadow. The cost of being unheard stood now at the edge of breaking. The radio channels filled with overlapping commands, voices straining to keep order as reports came in faster than they could be processed. Static burst between words. Maya heard calls for calm, for confirmation, for clarity, but none of it addressed the root of the moment. None of it corrected the word that had bent the path toward danger. The grit carried on the wind caught in her throat as she tried once more to speak. Voice, steady, determined. We need to amend the message now. But the operators were too deep in the noise, too focused on visible threats to hear the quiet accuracy that might have turned the tide. Maya's notebook, open to the page where she had underlined the risky phrase, seemed to weigh more in her hand. The warning was there, written clear, but unseen. The error, small when first noted, had grown in consequence. She stood in the shadow of the comms rig, the tool that might have bridged the gap denied to her. The air trembled with tension as the exercise veered toward what it was never meant to become. And Maya, unseen still, bore witness to the moment when truth unheard tipped the balance toward disaster. The world seemed to narrow to a single point, a breath held between forces on the edge of disaster. Dust hung motionless in the air, suspended by the stillness that came before action. The sun bore down hard, its light sharp enough to cut. At the perimeter, the rows of vehicles had stopped cold, the hum of engines the only sound beneath the thudding of distant rotors. Soldiers on both sides of the line stood rigid, weapons raised, eyes locked across the narrow no-man's land that separated them. A wrong word, a twitch of a finger, and the quiet would shatter. Radios crackled in fits and starts, voices sharp with strain, but none of them reached the heart of the moment. The loudspeakers, meant to command calm, had instead deepened the fracture. The wrong phrase had already been spoken, and its echo hung like smoke over the scene. Maya stood at the edge of the comms station, her breath steady despite the pounding of her heart. The heat pressed against her skin, the dust rough in her throat. Her notebook rested against her side, closed now, because what she needed was no longer written on the page, but carried in her mind, where years of listening and learning had etched it in lines deeper than ink. She watched as the tension stretched tighter, saw the shift in the opposing commander's stance, the silent signal that his next word might be the one to unleash the storm. Around her, the base seemed frozen. Operators hunched over radios, their faces pale with focus. Officers stood rigid, eyes on binoculars or screens. No one speaking. No one acting. Maya's hand hovered for a moment over the microphone. The weight of choice, heavy in that stillness. She thought of her father, of the nights at their small table where he had spoken the dialects of this region as if they were music, teaching her not just words, but the meaning behind them. He had taught her the shape of respect, the cadence of reassurance, the single phrase that, spoken in the right tone, could ease fear and signal peace where none seemed possible. Maya drew a slow breath. Her fingers closed around the microphone. The plastic felt warm beneath her touch, the dust rough against its edge. She lifted it, voice low at first, then firm, carrying across the crackle of static and the still air. She spoke the phrase, just a handful of words, simple in structure, rich with meaning. It was not the formal command taught in manuals or printed on scripts. It was the phrase known in the villages, in the homes of the people who now stood across the line, with weapons drawn. The words rolled out clear, steady, carried on the air like a bridge stretched between two cliffs. For a moment after, the silence deepened. The dust hung, the heat pressed down, and the world waited. The opposing commander's head tilted, his brow furrowed in the way of a man who hears something unexpected, something real. His hand, which had been raised in signal, lowered an inch. His eyes scanned the faces of his own men, then the line beyond, searching for the source of the words that had reached him in his own tongue, in a form he knew was not official, but true. A heartbeat passed, then another. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his arm again, but this time the signal was different. The weapons of his soldiers lowered, their bodies eased from the rigid tension of moments before. The storm broke, not in sound or fury, but in the soft release of breath, the settling of dust as the threat dissolved into quiet. Maya lowered the microphone, her hand steady. Around her, the operators stared, radios forgotten for the moment, as the truth of what had happened took hold. The officers at the command post turned from their screens and scopes, their silence heavy with the realization that the disaster they had braced for had been averted by a voice they had not expected, by words they had not thought to use. The tension that had gripped the base eased, though the air still shimmered with heat and dust. The world had turned. Not with the roar of engines or the crack of gunfire, but with the simple power of the right word at the right time. Maya stepped back from the comm station, the microphone resting on the table where she placed it with care. The notebook at her side no longer felt heavy. It had served its purpose. The knowledge it held had moved from page to voice, from silence to action. The dust that had hung motionless began to drift again, carried on the small breeze that swept across the field, now cleared of immediate threat. The sound of radios resumed, softer at first, then growing as operators confirmed the stand-down, as the machinery of order found its rhythm again. The opposing commander's figure grew smaller in the distance as he turned back toward his lines, his posture no longer rigid with tension, but firm with command that no longer required force. Maya watched until the dust obscured him, until the shapes of soldiers became shadows, until the weight of the moment settled into memory. The radio, conduit of chaos or peace depending on the hand that held it, now lay silent on the table. The notebook at Maya's side would open again, but not now. For now. The knowledge rested in the space between what had been said and what had been heard. The breeze lifted a small flag of dust from the edge of the field, a banner of quiet victory that no one would raise, but all would feel. Maya stood in that stillness, heart steady now, her role complete. There was no need for applause, no call for recognition. The right word had done its work. The power that had turned the tide lay not in the might of weapons or the force of commands, but in the courage to speak truth when it was needed most. And in that, Maya stood taller than any rank could mark, a quiet figure at the edge of the field where peace had found its voice. The air over the base felt different now. The weight of the standoff, so sharp and suffocating just moments before, had lifted, leaving behind a quiet that hummed with relief rather than tension. Dust settled slowly across the field, carried by a breeze that stirred the edges of flags and tugged at the loose corners of maps pinned to tables. The hum of the radios had changed, too. The sharp commands and overlapping calls for clarity had softened into a steadier rhythm. Voices calm as they confirmed positions and status reports. The metallic scent of warm equipment mixed with the earthiness of the dust, a reminder of how close everything had come to breaking and how swiftly the tide had turned. Maya stood at the edge of the comm station, exactly where she had been when she spoke the words that changed the course of the day. Her posture remained steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. The notebook that had felt so heavy with warnings earlier now rested on the table beside the silent microphone. Its pages, filled with lines of careful notes and marked with stars and underlines, no longer carried the same urgency. The truth she had tried to share quietly had already been spoken aloud, and the moment for recording had passed. The microphone, simple in design, lay where she had placed it, the plastic dark with dust, but its meaning heavier now than any symbol of rank or command. At first, no one moved. The officers who had filled the tent and command posts stood still, as if unsure how to step back into ordinary motion after the edge of disaster. The general, a figure who had until now seen Maya as a part of the background rather than a part of the team, turned from his position near the observation point. His gaze held steady on her, no longer distant or distracted but clear, as though seeing her fully for the first time. There was a pause, a breath held across the space between them, and then he started toward her. The distance was not far, but every step carried the weight of recognition long overdue. His boots stirred the dust as he crossed the field, the hum of radios and the quiet voices of operators the only sound filling the space between them. Around him, other officers hesitated, watching, unsure whether to follow. The ones who had laughed, who had brushed aside her warnings, felt the sting of their own dismissal more keenly now, though Maya's expression offered no judgment. She remained, as she had always been, calm, focused, ready to return to her work without fanfare. When the general reached her, he stopped and offered his hand. The gesture was simple, no speech or preamble, just the hand of a man acknowledging the truth of what had been done. Maya took it, her grip firm but without pride. The dust swirled softly around their boots. The breeze, lifting strands of hair that had escaped the tie at the back of her neck. The warmth of the sun pressed down, but the heat that had come from tension was gone, replaced by the quiet of understanding shared without words. Behind the general, the other officers began to move, drawn by the change they had witnessed. Some came with genuine gratitude, their faces open as they approached, offering their own hands in respect. Others came with shame in their eyes, the memory of their earlier dismissal of her still fresh, but willing now to acknowledge what they had refused to see. One by one they came, until the moment of recognition rippled outward across the command post, like a wave, quiet but undeniable. Among them was the junior officer who had been so quick with his jokes, the one who had shared the photo with the mocking caption. His steps were slower, his head slightly bowed, his voice low as he reached her. "I was wrong, ma'am," he said, the words plain and without excuse. "You saved us." His apology needed no embellishment. Maya nodded once, her expression soft but steady, accepting the words without gloating or resentment. The air carried the smell of warm metal and dust, the breeze lifting the tension that had hung so heavy only minutes before. The radios continued their work, voices now measured, reports given without the panic that had bled through earlier transmissions. The base began to move again, not with the rush of crisis, but with the rhythm of recovery. The vehicles at the perimeter shifted, engines idling as soldiers stood down. The opposing force that had once stood rigid and ready for conflict had long since retreated, their forms now no more than shapes on the far edge of the field, swallowed by distance and dust. Maya remained where she was for a moment longer. The general's handclasp released, the lines of officers moving past her, back to their stations, changed in how they looked at her, how they would remember her. The badge pinned to her uniform, once a marker unnoticed and unremarked, now caught the light in a way that drew the eye. A symbol, no longer ignored. The notebook on the table remained closed, its work for the day complete. The microphone beside it, silent and still, held its place as the object through which truth had been spoken, the tool that had carried the right words at the right time. The breeze lifted the dust once more, and with it, the weight of what could have been. Maya turned at last, her posture unchanged, her focus steady. She did not seek attention, nor did she linger in the glow of recognition. Her place was among the tools and records of the task, where she had always belonged, and where she would continue to serve. The respect she had earned would last, not because it had been loudly declared, but because it had been proven in the moment when it mattered most. And in that quiet, in that space between what had nearly happened and what had been averted, Maya stood as she always had, a figure of quiet dignity, her truth finally seen. Evening settled gently over the base, the last rays of the sun casting long, soft shadows across the tarmac and turning the dust in the air to gold. The heat of the day had faded, leaving behind a warmth that clung only to the metal of vehicles and the walls of temporary shelters. Lights blinked to life along the pathways and edges of tents, their glow steady and calm. No longer the harsh glare of readiness, but the quiet presence of a place at rest. The hum of generators filled the air with a low, constant rhythm, a reminder that the base, like its people, never truly slept. From somewhere near the center, the sound of voices carried, low and easy, the laughter of relief, the murmur of plans for the next day of the morrows. The voices of men and women unwinding after a day that had balanced so close to disaster. Maya's quarters stood near the edge of the compound, a small space set slightly apart, just beyond the main path. The structure was simple, one of many prefabricated units arranged with the same functional purpose that shaped the entire base. Inside, the room reflected its occupant. The bed was neatly made, the corners of the blanket tucked tight. A small desk held a lamp, switched off, its base surrounded by an orderly stack of notebooks and worn reference materials. The shelf above bore no decoration, only books, some battered from years of use, their spines faded but intact. The window beside the desk stood open just enough to let in the night air, carrying with it the scent of dust, paper, and the faint coolness that came after sundown. Maya sat at the desk, the chair creaking softly beneath her as she leaned forward, the dim light from outside casting a faint glow across her workspace. In front of her lay 2 notebooks. One was hers, familiar, filled with the careful lines of script that recorded the details others missed. The other was older, the cover scuffed and softened at the edges, the pages within yellowed by time and handling. She ran her fingers over the worn surface, pausing at the place where her father's name, once written in clear ink, had begun to fade. The book had traveled far, as he had, carried from post to post, from camp to camp, through years of service in places where language was the bridge between peace and conflict. She opened the notebook with care, the paper soft beneath her touch, and turned to the pages where his notes lived still. Lines of dialects, fragments of phrases, small observations about tone and rhythm that shaped meaning in ways no translation device could catch. She traced the words with her gaze, remembering the sound of his voice as he spoke them, the way he had taught her not just to hear, but to understand. The phrase she had spoken that day lived in those pages, written long before she had needed it, handed down as quietly as any inheritance. Maya reached for her own journal, the cover dark with use but solid beneath her hand. She opened it to a fresh page, the pencil steady between her fingers. The air in the room felt still, the only sound the faint hum of the bass beyond, the creak of the chair as she shifted, the soft scrape of pencil on paper as she began to write. The words came without flourish, plain and clear, a record not of pride, but of duty fulfilled. She wrote the date, the place, and the phrase that had bridged the gap when all else had failed. No description of her role, no note of the hands that had reached out in respect afterward. Only the truth of what was spoken and what it had done. The work of memory laid down in quiet lines. The breeze stirred the edge of the page as she finished, lifting it just enough to catch the fading light. She closed the journal, setting it beside her father's notebook, the two volumes resting together, old and new, past and present, linked in purpose. She rose from the chair, the movement quiet, deliberate, the chair giving one last soft creak as she stepped toward the window. Outside, the base lay in shadow and light, the paths marked by lamps that glowed like small stars, the outlines of tents and vehicles softened by the night, the voices of the watch calm, the rhythm of peace holding steady. Maya placed her hands on the window frame, the wood cool beneath her palms, and looked out across the base. The glass reflected her face faintly, a ghost of an image layered over the lights beyond. The dust of the day clung to the sill. The air smelled of earth, cooling beneath the night sky, of paper, and of memory. She stood for a long moment, letting the quiet of the evening settle around her, the weight of what had been done balanced by the simplicity of the moment. No banners flew, no speeches filled the air, only the steady hum of a place at rest, held safe by the work of a word spoken true. The light at the edge of the horizon faded, and the stars began to claim the sky. Maya remained at the window until the last glow slipped away, then turned from the view, the room behind her as it had always been, simple and ready. The books remained on the desk, waiting for the next note, the next word that might be needed. The night deepened, and the bass breathed with it, steady, at peace. And in that peace, Maya's legacy found its place, quiet and enduring, written not in titles or praise, but in the simple truth of what was done when it mattered most. In the end, what mattered most was not the rank on a uniform or the loudest voice in the room, but the quiet courage to act when it counted. Maya stood as a reminder that true strength often comes from those who are overlooked, that self-worth is not given by others, but found in doing what is right. She did not seek recognition, yet her words carried the power to change the course of a day and protect those around her. Her story invites you to consider the value of quiet resilience and the impact of choices made with clarity and purpose. Take a moment to reflect on what unseen strength means to you. Share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in the power of stories like Maya's, follow for more journeys where quiet voices make all the difference.